This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with British artist Sarah Ball on the eve of her first solo show in New York at Stephen Friedman Gallery. The conversation explores the evolution of her images, the growing scale of her work, her refined surfaces, and the inspirations for her ambiguously complicated portraits. The new exhibition, titled Tilted, features large-scale paintings which explore notions of dandyism in the 21st century. And now, a conversation about art and the exploration of identity with artist Sarah Ball. Thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Sarah, you have a solo show coming up this week at Stephen Friedman Gallery at 54 Franklin Street in New York. It's up Friday, February 23rd to Saturday, March 23rd. Sarah, it's a pleasure to get to talk to you. I love your work. A lot of times with artists, I like to start with a hypothetical, which is, say you're sitting at a dinner party next to a perfect stranger who has no idea who you are, what your work consists of. How do you start to describe to them what you do and what your work is?
Oh gosh, that's a tricky question, but thank you for your welcome anyway. But yes, that is a tricky question. I think my work is sort of ambiguously complicated. I think that it sort of feels like it's one thing, that there's more to it. So I guess on first glance you'd think I was primarily a portrait painter, but I would sort of never ever class myself as a portrait painter. I think it's to do with there's much more of an idea behind the work that I make that's not about just capturing the likeness of a person. So for me, the work that I've made has always had a sort of connecting idea behind it, or so that each painting has got some answer to a theme or a question, maybe. That makes sense?
Yes. I think it's really interesting that one of the first words you use to describe your work is tied to ambiguity. Right. I mean, it seems that at some point in your artistic journey, there was something that you grabbed onto there in terms of a place of interest in ambiguity. Can you kind of talk about the attraction of mystery or ambiguity and how, as an artist, sometimes it's a little bit easier said than done?
Yeah, I mean, I think almostly I'd say that it's not something I'm particularly conscious about it being a main thing in my work. I think that it's almost an accidental thing that has sort of come about. I don't think it's something that I'm actively seeking. I think the subject matter that I paint and the way that I paint it may feel like that's what it's about.
As we go down this road as an artist and you're on a journey, do you look back and, I've seen your work for years, whether it's through Conduit Gallery, your work has always had this very soft aesthetic, but the content has changed over the years slightly and the scale has changed.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the earlier work, perhaps going back maybe 10 years to like your Accused series? Was that kind of a turning point in your development, or has one stone been a stepping stone to the next?
Yeah, no, I think it was very much a turning point. I think it's the very first time that I embraced the idea of a portrait and that being part of something with a bigger thought process, with more rigor behind it. But that is the very first time I made the front on engaging with you portraits. And the accused I did made a long series of works that were looking at the idea of, well, basically they were taken from police photographs, and sort of very interested in the cataloguing and of the nature of crimes that were committed. So a lot of the people who, although they are accused, they are, civil rights activists. They are people that are making, doing good. So I think, that was the very first sort of look at the idea of how we could be defined or defined by others and hence I gave them the name of the crime that they committed, and that was all you knew about them. There was no other backstory or anything, and in fact very little that I knew about them as well. So
one of those pieces in particular, it was I think it was, again, they were titled by their crimes, but it was sexual perversion and prostitution. It was a person that I'm not sure how much you know about their crime, but it looked like some large part of whatever crime it was the fact that the person wasn't presenting themselves as the gender that they were born with, right? And because these were vintage mugshots, correct?
Oh yes, yes, absolutely. And from the time that they were first invented, really, as a way of classification. So yes, I mean, some of the crimes were just, diabolical, thinking about what people were arrested for. So this is very much a look to the past.
When I see some of the writing about your work from that period, there's a term that I don't think I've really come across before, but it was anthropometry. And can you define that term? It seems a little bit like eugenics, right?
It is, yeah, very much so. I think it was a classification in which there was a sort of a scheme made that if you could take the measurements of a person's face in terms of the width of their forehead, the length of their nose, the whole width of their face and things, that it was sort of a measuring device because it was thought that you could identify someone's character purely by looking at them, and that if you were a criminal, you would share those characteristics with another criminal, or and it was actually widely used for a long time. I can't remember exactly when it was completely got rid of, but they are the forerunner of the mugshots that we are still used, I think, where the person's details were taken, identifying marks and things like that.
In a way, it's kind of an interesting idea to think that bad people look bad and good people look good, but it seems like they would just really be heavy laden with a lot of bias. It just seems very dangerous, right? And and that's really not much unlike concepts that we're dealing with right now with facial recognition, and even as we have conversations about AI, just about bias in the data sets, right? How these data sets carry over the biases of the people who created the data two or three decades ago.
Absolutely horrendous, yeah.
Tell me about the evolution of your scale, right? Because those pieces that we're talking about were probably roughly 9 inches by 7.5 inches, and now the work is probably closer to a meter squared, right?
2.5 meters by 2.
Oh my! And so, so that's a huge difference in scale. How did that evolve? At what point did you decide that for you to have a different impact, you needed to deal with the scale in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the time the scale was, I was looking and making work from miniature, tiny photographs. So that did have an impact, and I made a lot of that work. I made a lot of that scale work. I also had a tiny studio, tiny studio that I couldn't have made much bigger work, to be fair. But over the years, it sort of gradually grew a little bit more. And then I got a bigger studio. But also, I think with the work that, I don't know, the Accused series and the Immigrant series felt very much looking to the past, even though the ideas that I was working with were sort of fueled by what was happening in the world at the time that I made the work. I looked at the past to sort of make a connection. And I think that what happened with the work when it shifted and it became more about identity in one-to-one identity. And I think that the work began to, the work is about what's happening in the world now. It just felt the right time I just needed to explore the bigger scale, and it's just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And, I think there's a time with my work where it's quite interesting, where the idea of the painting takes over, and that's happening much more now. So I feel like I'm less documenting an idea and more making a painting, and the painting has to exist in its own right. And that's definitely where I am now. I'm sort of, I guess, editing the photographs that I work with more and making drawings from them, which then become the start of a painting. So, it sort of shifted in its whole focus, basically, and the idea of the painting has taken over as much as the subject matter.
The newer work, as we mentioned, large scale, they're contemporary. As we mentioned earlier, there seems to be a bit of gender fluidity in the subjects. There's a certain amount of curating you do of what you want to detail and what you don't. And that there are certain things that are softened. And when you start softening certain things to a point, it's hard to identify those things that kind of draw the line between, different genders.
Yeah.
And can you talk a bit about, it sounds like you're moving from kind of documenting these individuals to paintings that are inspired by images. Are they true to a particular person? I mean, each one has the name of a person that it's tied to, but are you creating fictions, or is it true to the person's nature? It seems like a great deal of this practice is around choosing what to include and what to massage, because you're creating a new reality.
Yeah, I mean, all the people that I paint are real people. They all exist, and I am in touch with them all. I gain permission to make the work. So they are very much based on real people. So I always seek permission and share images with the person as I'm making them. But I think a good way to describe it is that I've shared most of my life with a documentary filmmaker, and our practices sort of share certain aspects. I think it's that piecing together of snippets of information that sort of create a truth or a version of the truth. And I think that plays back into that social media idea that, you can completely reinvent a whole character, your whole personality that is different to what, to reality maybe. And so it's playing with the idea of social media, and I'm interested in that interplay between fact and fiction. Having said that, the paintings do look like the people I've painted. I think what happens in the process is that there's that sort of coming together of documentary and, as I said before, the idea of a painting. And so I will make the work, but then I won't ever add anything that doesn't exist. I never add anything, but I might take something away. So for me, the idea that the painting has to work as a painting, so I could put some details in and it just feels like it's too noisy, it's overcrowded, and so I'll edit those details out of the painting, which that's my process. So I think I'm always looking for a quiet, clear, there's that feeling of the work that I hope comes across. And that's what I see in the people that I paint as well. And that's why I paint them, because, not only are they wonderful and extraordinary, but they're also, I do connect with them on a human level. And I think that's really important to the work as well.
Are you on Instagram every day? Tell me about how that process works. I mean, do you have a file that you just kind of stash, you're clipping and stashing and then deciding whether or not you want to reach out to somebody, and do you direct message them? I mean, how does that interaction come about?
Exactly that, really. I mean, I'll find people who I'm interested in painting, and that might lead on to another person. So I'll reach out, start a conversation, always gain permission to use their images. But I've also not only used social media, I've painted my daughter, I've painted her friends, I've painted friends of my family, I've started street casting now. So some of the people I've met in shops or in cafes and stuff like that. So it's sort of changing. But I mean, I do paint several people over and over again as well. So, and that's led on to quite a good relationship with people, and to the point where they may send me images that they think I might like to work with as well. So
Right.
it's, it's,
Well, that was going to be another question I had, which was I noticed 4 or 5 images that had the same name, like
yes,
like Elliot. But
yeah.
if I were to put them in a lineup, I don't know if I would necessarily recognize one Elliot as being the other. And I'm just wondering if there are different Elliots, or if this is the different personas that this particular Elliot takes on. That that they are a bit of a chameleon, and one is one look versus another.
Yeah, well, there's two Elliots. There are two Elliots, and one of the Elliots does change their persona quite a lot. Their look changes, and hair color changes, fashion changes, and things. So I think that's definitely part of why I'm drawn back to painting them. But also, I think over the years, the way I've painted them has changed. And that's probably leading to a different, I'd say the painting in the show at the moment has more depth and that's quite a new thing for me. And I think that's just the way that the painting process has changed as well. So it might look slightly different, but Elliot does change their look quite a lot.
We've talked about that change in scale. I mean, that's also a change, I imagine, in how you physically are even painting, right? Because if you just didn't have the luxury of space and you're working on pieces that are the size of a sheet of paper versus something that's much larger scale, we're talking about fine brush work with a fine-haired brush. I don't know if you need a magnifying glass versus something much larger where your whole arms in the motion, and it's kind of a different prescription for how you paint when you change scale that dramatically, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And it's something I've referred to in the past as a sort of physicality of painting, because it suddenly feels so much more physical. I use a step ladder. The whole thing is very, very different. Although I still use very small brushes, even on the large scale works, but I also use massive brushes as well. So the whole feeling is different. And also the surfaces are very, very different. So I'm working on a much thicker and heavier linen than I've ever worked on before. And that's enabled that depth that I was talking about. And it's enabled, when you see the surfaces, they are extremely flat and fine. And, it's almost like there's no brush strokes really, which is not something I particularly do on purpose, but it's just very instinctive to my practice. And it feels to me like the pigment is just being soaked into the linen
Mm.
and build up very thin layers and thin layers. So it takes it does take a long time to make the work, but it is. I'm just loving the process. It's just brilliant.
In terms of material, so you're using linen, and then what is the process like for you building up? I assume are you gessoing and sanding and gessoing and sanding to get a really fine surface? And what medium are you? I mean, are you using like linseed oils, or is it more kind of a turpentine sort of?
So I actually use a untreated linen at the moment, so it's unprimed. So it's a very primed,
No wonder it's so absorbent.
but it is unprimed. So yeah, I mean, it just takes layer upon layer upon layer. But I use oil paint, and I use I think, I don't know whether you get that over here, but I use Zest It, which is like a natural alternative to paint thinner, really. And I also use a linseed oil. But the very first layers are always built up with quite a watery wash. And I find that I thicken that, over the process, and then it enables me to sort of get a bite into the surface, really.
Right. I think they call that fat over thin. Right.
Yeah.
Let's talk about this particular show. For folks that are coming to see this show at Stephen Friedman Gallery, what can they expect to see when they show up?
Okay, so there are literally I think there are 10 paintings, ranging from minute miniature to, as I said, 2 by 2.5 meters. And I've sort of chosen to link the work by a sort of an investigation into the idea of a modern day dandy. So as always, the work is tied together by thoughts about identity. So that could be, anything from ethnicity, race, sexuality, religion, gender, non-gender, the music you listen to, and all of those things feed into who we are. But I read an essay a couple of years ago by Andrew Solomon, and he was discussing sort of the idea of the dandy throughout history. And I noticed that the article was written, I think it was in 2004, which was obviously pre-Instagram. And I just wondered how it would relate, and whether those ideas exist when we're completely flooded with imagery now. And it sort of felt a bit tongue-in-cheek, really, but that Instagram is almost like that, a modern day version of the promenade, where you would dress up and go and be seen, basically. So I just sort of looked into characters that I would consider to be dandies, basically.
So again, these were cast from family, friends, Instagram. Yeah. Did you find them in the dandy attire that you were looking for, or were some of them? Did you ask, is there something even more spectacular that you might want to share with me?
No, it was all very much them. So I painted from the majority of the paintings in this show are from existing photographs. So they were already posed and dressed as I've worked with. So I'm just checking mentally. Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah.
When I look at your work, it seems, especially when I'm able to kind of step back. We have the benefit of on a screen when we look at the thumbnails all together. They're in. Again, if you're in the gallery, you can kind of span across the space and see how these works come together. And there is a palette. There is a certain palette range, a tonal. A tonal range that they all seem to share. Is that kind of an intentional palette that you have developed over the years? Does it just feel comfortable? Is it part of taking the focus off of what surrounds the person and focusing it on them? Can you talk a little bit about your choices when it comes to color?
Yeah, I mean, it really, it's completely instinctive. I find that a painting will grow. So I'll start with a certain feature, usually in the face, and the painting will grow from there. And it's reactionary. I'm really fascinated by the figure ground relationship. And so, especially with this show, actually, there's a lot of almost disappearing into the ground. And that, it's just been a fascination of mine for quite a few years. But so the terms of the palette it's just purely instinctive to me. I don't have I sort of have a vague idea about how a painting will look at the end of it, but it can change a lot during the process. And so, it's a reactionary process for me. But in terms of it being quite subdued, I think it's just instinctive to me, really. There's no reason for that other than it's, I was sort of, when I was doing my MFA, I was obsessed with Agnes Martin. So I think that the work is very much a continuation of who I am. And, I do strive to create a very sort of calm, it's just a very natural process for me to make work like that. So
I can certainly see where you would have an affinity for Agnes Martin, and I can almost imagine if I were to take one of your images into Photoshop and blur it. I imagine that the tones would be very similar to an Agnes Martin piece. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and I looked at early Lucian Freud's as well. Similar palette, and yeah, it just feels very natural to me.
Let me ask you this: what role do you feel the artist plays in society today, and how do you feel that your work is fitting within that context?
Gosh, that's such a hard question to answer. But I mean, I think that for me, art is at its most interesting when it's communicating an idea. And I don't think that there can be a simple description of what the role of the artist is. I think it's, the role of the artist is different things to many, many different people. And, people look at art in different ways and like lots of different things. But for me, it's always really much more intriguing when there's a strong idea behind something. And, I hope that my work is translating an idea or a thought process or that relates to what's happening in the world at the moment, really.
Where do you see your work going from here? I know that it's always this huge Excel, having crossed the finish line, the work is in the gallery, and will you take some time off, and then do you already know what the next group is going to be like?
Yeah, I'm sort of continuing with the idea at the moment because I've got people to paint, so I've got my catalogue of people to paint, so they're that it's still driving this idea, and I'm working towards a show next year as well, so it will be a continuation of the work that I'm making now. But also I do see that I think the work in the future might look at the idea of relationships within the canvases that I make, and that the scale may change in terms of the figure within the frame of the painting may alter, and there may be I've sort of met a really interesting couple recently, and I think that I'd like to paint them together within the work. So that might happen soon.
That would be a real departure. So do you find yourself with more people that you want to paint than time available to paint them?
Yeah, but I just sort of collect them as I go along, and it's there's always people that I'm really excited to make work with, and uh, the paintings take a long time, so I don't make a lot of work, and but I'm constantly finding people, so and that's really exciting because it just spurs you on constantly.
Sarah, I really appreciate you taking time to take time out during this busy week to talk to me about your work and your process and your aesthetic. And I really wish you the best of luck with the show at Stephen Friedman Gallery. It's up Friday, February 23rd to Saturday, March 23rd. Sarah, thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, and thank you so much. It's really lovely to meet you, and thanks for the introduction.
Absolutely. That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.